Welcome to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. I'm joined today by Cecilia Marshall, who's the Chief Advancement Officer at Ed Advancement. Cecilia, welcome to Trending in Education.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me.
It's great to have you. And we're going to be talking today about AI because it's 2025 and we're talking about education trends. So AI is one of them that everybody's thinking about, everybody's talking about. But in particular, we want to talk today about how it can benefit folks who may need educational advancement. HBCUs in particular in higher ed is something that I know you have a lot of experience with. And then, there's both upside and then there's some risks around how AI might be used for those students and other students like them. We'll be getting into that in a bit. But before we do that, we always like to start with your background in your own words. Can you share with us your professional origin story?
Sure. So my professional origin story, I definitely took a meandering path. I started out actually in corporate advertising. And so I have a fine arts background and into corporate advertising.
You're a photographer, right? Like I think
That was my major.
Yeah.
My major. So I was an art producer in New York City at BBDO. So I did about 5 years in corporate advertising, and I just decided, that was probably not going to be my life's work. So I got into, working at my alma mater, working in admission at Savannah College of Art and Design. And I really just felt like I was always advocating for scholarships for students. So I went into scholarships. And I've been predominantly most of my career working in scholarships as a scholarship provider, most recently at the Jackie Robinson Foundation, before that at the Jack Kent Cooke Foundation, and then before that at the Asian and Pacific Islander American Scholarship Fund. So I spent a lot of my days, working around culturally responsive programming for students receiving scholarships. But what I did see in my work was that really, while scholarships are amazing for, sort of networking, mentoring, and partnership and really just motivational, the biggest decision was where the student chose to go to college and what supports they were receiving there. So I really switched gears and joined Ed Advancement in 2021 to really support the institutions that are making, the greatest impact with students, which are HBCUs. So, that's sort of how I ended up here. And I think in terms of strengthening the institutions that are, doing the best at social mobility is the best way to move systemic change. While I really loved working with students and scholarships, the system is flawed. And I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done, to ensure that students get the best education they can.
Yeah. And then maybe a couple words about Ed Advancement specifically, its history and what it's focused on.
So Ed Advancement is a relatively young nonprofit, started around 2018. So our mission is to support social mobility by strengthening mission-focused colleges and universities that serve primarily low-income, first-generation, and under-resourced students and families. And we do that work predominantly with HBCUs to date. So we've worked with over 70 institutions, and we really partner with institutions to serve them through sort of digital transformation and responsive support, but also customizing technology platforms and providing a shared service model for those platforms. But it really is about meeting the institutions where they are with what they need, and ultimately to some very common goals, which is to increase enrollment and increase student success. So retention, persistence, graduation, and ultimately, high-paying careers so that they can, have that, that dream of, increasing their standing.
Yeah, makes sense. And then Ed Advancement being relatively young, HBCUs have been around for quite some time. And I imagine things like AI and things that are kind of new and emergent, you've been there since 2021. It's a pretty transformative period that we're living in, and artificial intelligence, the future of work, the disruptions that are kind of rippling through our culture these days are, certainly something that I imagine HBCUs and HSIs and others, need help and need some focused attention from folks like yourself. How have you been thinking about and starting to work with HBCUs and others around artificial intelligence?
I think from a personal perspective, when I first started, dabbling in AI, it was really coming from a place of fear. I think I was one that a few years ago watched the Netflix documentary by Dr. Joy Buolamwini at the Algorithmic Justice League now. But, really seeing the harm that had been done to communities of color with AI, with facial recognition. And so I think from my personal place where I sit, that was my first introduction, is really all of the risks that are associated with algorithms, and really what it's been used for and continues to be used for. So I think you have to come to that place as well when you're serving, communities that look like yourself and also communities that may have the same understanding. That being said, in the higher education space, in this sort of world of, machine learning, data, and being able to own your data, there is a place of power that this can come from for the institutions. We certainly see the chance of this being a bigger divide, but it also could be something that closes some digital divides.
Hmm.
So thinking from the perspective of the approach is really around where can we find efficiencies when you're supporting institutions that are historically underfunded, historically under-resourced. Talking about efficiencies is not something that is harmful. We're not looking to displace staff. We're really just looking to be efficient with potentially administrative tasks that take you from being forward facing with a student. So that's really been a lot of the interest, as well as customer service chatbots. And so certainly we're not touching anything with facial recognition, but I think there is a chance. And I think it's important, to look at the data. Students are using AI, and I think there's still that lens of concern from the students using AI, but I think it's something where you have to, as the educator, as the institution, you have to be moving as fast as your students and really be able to adapt. So there is a chance that it could, be a catalyst to kind of level the playing field in terms of maybe data storage, or even, kind of moving data to a cloud structure. But I think there is generally what we hear from students in the institutions that they want to be a part of the actual process, not the recipient of a tool, but a part of the process. And so that's really the lens we try to take.
Yeah, the term that's been coming up a lot in conversations about this stuff is co-design. How do you get the right people at the table? How do you get the right level of buy-in and also trust? You're mentioning, facial recognition and some of the biased data sets that were used to kind of originally do the formative training with a lot of these models. That's difficult to unwind and retrain. And then similarly, the humans who've been dealing with this stuff, maybe they've had bad experiences. Maybe they don't necessarily trust the technology. How do you think about that? How do you build the kind of on-ramps into this stuff in a way that is safe, I guess, for folks who might feel like this technology might actually not be for them?
I mean, I think we've done a lot of co-design in our, sort of transformation initiatives around technology. It really is about the first step being conversations with institutions. And I think really talking about using AI tools to be able to own your data, because there's a general frustration sometimes with multiple different providers they might be using that start to charge when they want to sort of use the data in a way that wasn't necessarily, for that tool, but to, take that data and use it in a larger data set. There starts to be some sort of pricing, or there's an extra charge to move data somewhere.
Yeah.
So I think there is a frustration of, this is our data, we should be able to use it. So there is this sort of conversation around, can you use kind of unstructured data, possibilities to then move your data and actually create models that are based solely on your data. I think
I
that
see.
is very, very interesting to institutions to say, hey, take all of my data alone,
Hmm.
the data of all the students we serve, the faculty and staff we have, and say, hey, how can we support students earlier from this data set? Not other HBCUs, not other MSIs, not PWIs,
Yeah.
everyone is so unique that they want to be able to do this. So the idea of being able to be proactive with just your data set is the most interesting to institutions, which brings up things like AI enablement is really what our conversation is. I think, you go to every conference right now and every session has the letters AI in it, like everything.
Yeah.
It's like AI this. And I did a fun panel last year that was like, AI, what's real, what's hype, because there's
Yeah.
a lot of hype out there. That
Yeah,
when
we're
you
we're big fans of the Gartner hype cycle here. So we've talked about the trough of disillusionment and how lots of AI is kind of heading into that, depending on the conversation that you're having.
And so I think it's really about, we've been saying AI enablement. That is what we're trying to do now. We've certainly, we work closely with Mainstay on AI customer service chatbots, text nudging. We did a partnership with the Yale Center for Social and Emotional Intelligence to, make sure that we were being culturally responsive. which is, AI, and we've done other initiatives, but I think the bulk of what we are focused on is the enablement. And we really
Hmm.
just mean the basics of data governance, data infrastructure,
Hmm.
and what you can do with it from that next one. So it's really the less exciting kind of, we start to say like
Yeah.
plumbing of the house is
Yeah.
what gets you to the fun modeling, predictive analytics,
Yeah.
those pieces. And so that's certainly, where our lens is from. So it's like we try
Hmm.
to be as real as possible of like, we're not, testing the latest, snazzy AI thing that you heard about at a conference. We are saying,
Right.
hey, institutions want to be able to use their data for
Right.
good with their students. And that is really, one of the most basic uses, but can be one of the most powerful uses in this space and can be one of the more costly, like it's relatively expensive to do infrastructure. But once you have that, the things that we need to use are a little bit more affordable, I think, than some of these, concepts that are out there.
Yeah, makes sense. Because one of the knocks I think on a lot of the large language models is that they're so big that you don't really know what, it's a black box in the middle and there's so much stuff in there, you don't really know what's coming out. Where there has been more of this movement towards what you're describing, which is more like a smaller, focused model based on just the data that you know is clean and you know is relevant to your particular institution and its use cases. So let's say the plumbing gets hooked up right and you got that base level infrastructure
Mhm.
in an HBCU, for example. What are some of the ways in which HBCUs can then use that data to kind of drive student outcomes and drive, institutional objectives?
I think once, everything is sort of enabled to be able to leverage these tools, it's a lot about sort of personalized pathways, thinking about career planning, but even just student advising and mentorship, being able to scale those,
Yeah.
and even just automating tasks, that are taking up admin time. I think
Hmm.
those three things can create large movements in student success numbers, especially no institution can provide high touch advising to every single student. It's just not possible. And so
Right.
everyone needs to make sure that they're not missing the student, that if you don't get them right now, they will be out next term and you've lost them. And so I think
Yeah.
the idea that you can quickly provide the support that you do have, and maybe it's not even additional advising, but it's just a nudge to say, hey, we see you. And
Hmm.
and we know that this is, this is the challenge, and here are some resources on campus, just sort of calling out there are resources and that
Hmm.
you're noticed, is I think important. So I think it is that personalized pathway, maybe degree navigation. It could potentially eliminate this sort of the game. If you talk to most people, they'll say, oh, well, the students change their majors so much. And that's okay. Everyone has a different idea of what they think they want to do when they enter college and what they want when they're out. But is there a way to sort of, with the data set of the institution and, a little bit of, questionnaire survey, be able to say, hey, this might be the best pathway for you so that you're not changing your major 4 or 5 times because
Hmm.
it's personalized to where you are, and even understanding where you came. Like
Right.
if you're tying in your sort of, we've been working closely with Technolutions on this Slate CRM. And so you're bringing all of the data from when they were, pre-college into college, plus what's happening in college, and then pushing it out. Or even
Yeah.
being able to say, hey, these are all of the classes you took. Let's make sure your resume shows the true skills you do have based on just the course catalog, which I think we're not there yet, of like saying,
Right.
hey, these are tangible workforce skills based on what you learned. You are career ready. It's just about understanding which courses are the most marketable to the position that you're looking to find, or even potentially sort of AI coaches on the staff level. So, it can be a very daunting task as a career advisor, career success advisor, to be advising such a multitude of new fields.
Yeah.
Like a prompt as a field, like, training prompts is like that didn't exist 10 years ago. So how would anyone be able to, like, sort of like, maybe there's a chance for that career advisor to have a coach for themselves, say, okay, hey, here are some trending careers. What do you need to know? Because
Yeah.
I think there, to the point earlier, there's an aversion to like giving an AI based tool to a student, but
Hmm.
there's a little bit less aversion if staff are sort of the stop point. Like, it's not actually accessing the student, but it's supporting the staff member that's accessing the student so that that staff member can use their professional judgment to say that is not, sort of valid without having the student kind of get bad information. I
Right.
understand that that can be daunting in the sort of another tool for a staff member. But I do think I can't imagine that a career advisor wouldn't be excited to learn more about emerging fields that didn't exist when they entered their
Hmm.
field. And so I think that faculty and staff are probably could be more open to the idea of using kind of coaches support that's AI
Hmm.
based than
Yeah.
saying, oh, give it to the students,
Right. Yeah, I'm always struck lately by how much chatbots are becoming sort of the modern day search window where
Mhm.
like we just expect chatbots everywhere. I've referred to it as Clippy's revenge, where like, the old Microsoft Clippy chatbot was around in the 90s, early 2000s, and we all were like, yeah, Clippy, whatever, we'll minimize him, he'll go away. But now it does seem like these things are coming back, and both for good and bad, I guess, to your point, where like in some cases, it's really an accelerator, a way to kind of like augment the human experience. And there are other ways in which it can kind of perpetuate bias or, spread information or do things that we don't necessarily want it to do. That all being said, it does sound like college age students and even younger are using these tools. How do you think about AI literacy? Or, I had Mike Yates on the show recently,
Mhm.
and he turned me on to the idea of AI dexterity, which is
Mhm.
beyond just understanding the AI. How do you use it in
Yeah.
service of your own goals, the goals of your community, the goals of, maybe like bigger purpose, the why that is really motivating you? Can any of these tools kind of motivate or accelerate some of those capabilities? How do you think about that? Because it does feel like your students and the colleges you work with, they're existing within this broader revolution that we're kind of in the middle
Mhm.
of. How do you kind of think about that, and how do you position your work so that it's, preparing people for where the world is heading?
I think for us so far, it's really been about strengthening sort of the infrastructure and the core, offerings of the institution. I think
Yep.
we as an organization have not touched on teaching and learning, which I think is really kind of what we're speaking to when you talk about students using AI and using chatbots to sort of learn. But just sort of like from a personal commenting perspective, I think everyone is playing catch up, the students and the faculty and staff. I think there are some organizations out there. Complete College America has their Council on AI, and they're doing an interesting new partnership with Ripen. So I think there's a lot of organizations working on the sort of literacy side of it. And I think that's impactful work. So that needs to happen. Everyone's sort of joking that like guardrails is the new bad word, like don't say guardrails. That's not what we do when you think about the capability is like pretty unlimited now of what students are trying out or testing. You can see faculty embracing it. Some of our institution presidents, or President Abdullah of Virginia State University, embraced AI immediately and asked, faculty and staff to use it to give him reports. There's examples where there's quite a few leaders in this HBCU space that are saying, hey, we want to be on top of this. We want to be innovative. And so I think that is the best course of action, is staying on top of it. I think it's not a time to sort of like sit back and wait and see. Like this is not a wait and see technology. This is a how do you, safely use it, engage it, and then set some, not guardrails, but some standards for students. I think students are looking for boundaries, and I think there
Hmm.
are some normal boundaries that they're setting in this field. And so I think there's like boundaries to make sure that you're within ethical compliance of your institution. And I think that's really right now at the institutional level. It could be a little confusing though for students, that speak with other students at other campuses of what you can or can't use. But I think if everyone's embracing it from the beauty of this innovation versus a disciplinary thing, you can already see, whether it's news articles or just anecdotally, is like the idea of using the word cheating with certain communities seems to be prevalent versus innovating with other communities. So I think if
Right.
everyone is treated in a basis of like, this is an innovative technology, let's all approach it from a place of the positive. I think that's where we might hit the hardest situations, is when people start to use it in a biased way of saying someone is cheating when it really is not the same as someone at another campus. I think it's something to guard against because, it's always communities of color that are first accused of cheating with a
Right.
technology versus, TWIs might be looked at as like, look, they're innovating with this technology. That's more from my own personal perspective, not from the advanced perspective, but that's what I
Yeah.
think when I see kind of teaching and learning and how it can be used. But I think it's still that age of like, I didn't grow up with chatbots, aging myself a
Yes.
little. So I didn't have a chatbot, but I
Yeah.
also, you can sense, and sometimes I do it myself. It's like, you can sense that it's easier to talk about a question that you might be embarrassed to ask of a bot
Yes.
not. And so I think harnessing that to sort of increase a student's engagement is fantastic.
Hmm.
It shouldn't be something to be frowned upon, if they're going to a bot versus a person, because they
Right.
just want to ask a question that they feel like, I don't really need a person to answer this. Even, maybe you don't need it. Sometimes it can just be that websites, if you go to any university website, they're probably one of the like infrastructure components that everyone feels like, okay, we're not where we'd like to be. Even the most resource institutions are probably like, yeah, we have some very legacy things
Yeah.
happening on our site, which is very hard for a student because they're going to the site for information. But everyone is running on these sites that may have like, when we first started building websites, everyone made like 100,
Yeah.
200, 300 pages. It was like, let's make another page. Let's make another.
Yeah.
And now you've got websites that have, 800 pages of information. And a student's like, can I just get the course catalog in a searchable text? No, it's a PDF I can't search. Okay. So there's like these just life challenges.
Yeah.
If you're just aggregating all of your content on your website alone
Yeah.
to a bot, that is a huge resource for a student because your search window's not working either. You go search
Right.
a website, that's not working.
Yeah.
That old school like menu of a website. I don't know who uses that, but there's like, it's pretty funny of how it could be, just scraping that website and making just purely like a website bot, not even a customer service, just like, I can't find something.
Yeah.
And I think we also ignore that students are interested in how things look. I think the corporate salesy side of their lives have evolved, whether it's, Netflix or Spotify, whatever it is
Yeah.
they're using,
Hmm.
it's beautiful. It's
Yeah.
involved. It personally knows them. It knows what
Hmm.
you watch. Like they're used to that level of personalization and they're
Yeah.
expecting it.
TikTok
Place where they're paying a quite higher, like what you pay a month,
for sure.
on that
Yeah.
versus what you're paying in tuition. In
Hmm.
their minds, they're thinking, why can't my institution have the same level of personalization as this, commercial tool that I love? So I think that's sort
Right.
of mindset on the customer service lens that we're also watching. And when I say personalization, that's what I mean. I mean, what are they used to? They're used
Right.
to knowing them and they're not creeped out by it as much as
Right.
maybe us in our mid 40s might be like, wow, I don't like that it knows what I do. But I think it's something that a current college student has grown up with
Yeah.
versus, back in the day when our data was nowhere, it was like no
Hmm.
one would know any of these things. So I think they're used to it and they expect you to serve them with it. If you're taking
Hmm.
my data, you should be able
Right.
to serve me with my data. Like I know you have it.
Hmm.
So I think they're looking for that connection at an institution.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then you mentioned before, like you're working with multiple HBCUs where, I'm sure it's another example of, one size fits none, even though folks from the outside might just view HBCUs as like one kind of thing. Each one has its own structure and history and culture. Are there any insights you've been able to garner by looking across, maybe perhaps on the organizational structure and how the kind of technology works, the plumbing side? Because it does seem like that's a place where you almost need to do the good, like data hygiene to be able to really reach some of the benefits that this technology has. And the opposite's also true, where if there's a lot of technical debt on your technology infrastructure, it's hard to just throw a chatbot at that and assume that everything's going to work great. Any examples or any insight you can provide? Because I know you have, a pretty broad perspective across HBCUs.
HBCUs, like all institutions, they're not a monolith. I think I would approach it more from historically under-resourced institutions, which crosses kind of
Hmm.
every type of institution. And I think when you are, less resourced, you make different decisions. But commonalities, I think, even a highly resourced institution would probably express the same challenges, but I think there are a little bit more of a common thread when it comes to, are you in on-premises storage? Like, is your student information system on-prem? And there are some commonalities in sort of like the most common student information system at HBCUs. So I think those are things that we're watching. And I think we saw it, this past summer with FAFSA. Are you at the current version of your student information system? Basic question. And that is a challenge for any under-resourced institution to say, we're on the current version. Yes. So some of the initiatives we had were getting you to the current version, making sure that you're there and ready to accept a new version of the FAFSA. But I think it's common challenges are things like your storage, your version of your student information system, your lack or like interest in data integration, but having challenges of how many IT staff you may have resource to that. So I think
Right.
everyone is looking for cloud-based storage that they can then use for data analytics. Everyone is looking for every platform to be integrated so that no one department gets a tool that no one knows what data is in it. I think it's very common that, oh, this department, highly resourced, are probably more guilty of buying tools in departments and then
Yeah.
no one else on the campus knowing about that tool or knowing what's in it.
Right.
And it's a disservice to the student that you've got a whole set of data here that when I go to one office, they have no idea about, and I'm
Right.
retelling it, or, they're just confused. So I think it's the idea is that everyone would like their tech stack to be streamlined. And I think that data governance is a challenge for everyone,
Yeah.
especially like as AI tools are added and as different things are competing. So I think really what we're seeing is what our institutions craving. They're craving sort of a model for data governance, limitless data integrations, and I think limitless ability to share important data back to the student as well as all faculty and staff, within reason of sensitive data. But I think it's even that a student being able to access their own information is a challenge. Like I gave this to you, where is it now? So I think those are the things that we're seeing when we look at under-resourced institutions and kind of what's been left behind. And sometimes it's still connectivity. There's still a connectivity issue, whether it's hardware or software upgrades. There are many rural, small town HBCUs, not necessarily rural by sort of coding standards, but not, in terms of the, how we iPads code, but there are what would be considered a town situation where internet is challenging. And when you start to think about all these interesting tools, if you have a connectivity issue, all bets are off. That is the priority. And so I think really thinking through, I think those are the things that we're seeing all around the sort of infrastructure component of it. And if we're honest, it's not an attractive thing for funders to fund all the time.
Right.
Saying, hey, we're behind in connectivity, we're behind in this, and we're behind because of systemic underfunding, which had to do with systemic racism. This is not we had the money and chose not to spend it. It's that the money was never there.
Right.
And we chose to serve our students. And so now can we use technology to sort of force multiply our faculty and staff, while remaining lean?
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned the staff part too, because that's the other part I was curious about, like more in terms of the organizational structure. Like my impression, because I talked to folks both on the enterprise side, in the private sector, and then also in higher ed, and the way they think about like data infrastructure and, data privacy, cybersecurity, frequently it comes from more of a position of abundance in the private sector, although it depends on the organization. And then it's a little more, shoestringing something together, not necessarily being as well resourced, and then just finding good IT talent. And then I guess in the case of HBCUs, like developing pathways to become IT talent. I imagine those are things you're grappling with.
Well, I think all of higher education is grappling with getting IT talent, and you just sort of multiply that when your budget gets smaller. So if the wealthiest institution is competing with corporate America, which is leading in AI. I mean, corporate America is the AI leader at this moment in time. So if you are, trying to compete for talent, the wealthiest are competing with corporate, but everyone is competing with corporate. So it's sort of as you work down the line of, what is your salary at an institution? And I think just, that constant reminder that most higher ed staff need to be on campus. So when you're competing, you're not only competing against money,
Right.
And it's a valid reason that you need to be on campus. I think there's, you need to see the students are there, the storage is there. Like there's a lot of reasons why IT staff generally need to be, on premises. And so I think I don't know the magic, answer for that, but it's a competitive market given that it's such a needed resource everywhere. Imagining, not-for-profit higher education, lowest paying salaries are the last to get a candidate. And it can be understandable that someone wants to take a higher paying, remote position for a tech company. But we have been sort of using, third-party support to support institutions. We've been trying to work on some creative models of how can we augment your resources within means. And then also, even if it's just, okay, we have this script from this institution that's using Banner, you can use the script. The script is not proprietary. You can also pull your data into the CRM with this. So I think there's also creative ways of sharing. I think that's the key when you're working with a network like HBCUs, which are historically community driven.
Yeah.
There is an interest in sharing knowledge amongst the network. Certainly there's always, there's always competition between any institution, and there's like historic feuds between institutions, and usually more on the sports front. But
Yeah.
there is like given the historic nature of HBCUs, there is an interest in supporting all HBCUs with knowledge sharing. So I think there
Hmm.
is that common element of, where we sit in this place of supporting each other. So when it comes to something, as long as it's not a proprietary or a security issue or something that's truly brand associated,
Yep.
we have shared across institutions, or even when we do co-design, we bring 10 or 20 HBCUs together.
Yep.
You're designing, you may not get this tool next week or don't want it next year, but you're supporting the development of a tool that will go to the network. That co-design process is something we've been able to do kind of with our Slate CRM and with some of our other tools that has been really helpful in that knowledge sharing piece. But don't have a good answer for how we solve the IT staffing crisis other than
Hmm.
we need more college graduates that are in IT. And it might be more corporate partnerships. I think
Right.
while you're getting all the talent, is there a way to also strengthen the institutions that you're pulling,
Hmm.
talent from?
Yeah. And it's another reason why organizations like Ed Advancement are important, because you can see those connections across, where when you're within an institution or even within a silo within an institution, one of the things that's hard is to get, that broader bird's eye, eagle eye view of the whole system, so you can start to figure out what's the most efficient way to really design things and what are some smart ways where we can share what's working. It's been an amazing conversation here with Cecilia Marshall, who's the Chief Advancement Officer at Ed Advancement. What's next? What's on the horizon? Some of this is hard work and it's not short timelines, I'm sure. So, like, getting people's, plumbing, data plumbing and systems organized in a way that they can really, reap some of the benefits of what's emerging. But if you look a little bit further out, what gets you excited, and then, what maybe makes you a little bit nervous?
I get excited about the AI enablement. It doesn't sound exciting, but I get excited about the idea that a campus, if they heard something at a conference, that they're able to leverage it. If they've heard success at another institution and they want to be able to grab that tool for their students, that they're ready, and that
Hmm.
it's not a question of, oh, this plus this cost. The excitement is, it's not necessarily about a tool we've given an institution. It's really about the change management that comes with digital transformation. So the idea that by having, this academic tool, you were able to kind of force the updates to the course content, force the updates from your maybe different faculty and staff to ensure that your course catalog is correct, so that then, hey, 5 years, if you decide, what, that tool that we worked with you at Advancement on is great, but we want to move to something else, that you as an institution can do that without us. You've
Yeah.
watched how the platform change can happen, and you can manage that change. As I see, anything that we've sort of worked with an institution to provide to date will be obsolete, in 10 years. It will be something
Right.
different, but it was more about the change management involved in
Hmm.
being innovative
Yeah.
and moving your institution that prepares you for those kind of next 10 years. I
Hmm.
think I get excited at AI being able to close the divide between wealthy, highly resourced institutions and those that are under resources doing incredible work on social mobility. Like, that's the hope. And
Yeah.
fear is that it further divides and the wealthy get wealthier.
Mm.
Certainly the fear, but I think I'm going to go with the hope side of, we have students here, which are our leaders, invested in this technology, excited
Yeah.
about it. How could we go wrong if we let them lead, kind of on this and be designers, be a part of it, so that, in 10 years, they're the ones out there sort of running the companies and building these tools. So I think it's really just about harnessing the students and keeping them at the center of where we go.
Yeah. Makes sense. We started off talking a little bit about you. I'd maybe want to bring it back there a little bit before we wrap up. Any advice for folks? Because you were touching on your circuitous career path, but you've wound up at a pretty interesting position here in the
Yep.
world of higher ed. Anything you want to share with our listeners around how you got there or what worked for you?
It's interesting to how I got here. I'm a board member of the Legal Defense Fund, and every year we do the Marshall Motley Scholars Program selection, which is in honor of my grandfather, Thurgood Marshall, and Judge Motley. And so, whenever we interview those students, I always think, wow, they've really got it together and they have a plan and it's amazing. And I'm so hopeful for our country when I meet them, and, the idea that they're going to be civil rights attorneys in the South, continuing an incredible legacy. of those two names, I get excited. So I think I sort of ground myself in any advice I give. I definitely didn't have it together then when I was graduating, but I think it's really about, picking a career that drives your passion. For me, higher education is a social good. It's a way to get us to a true democracy. It is the future for students. It is their path to a better future. It continues to be. We may talk about credentials or different pathways, but for someone coming from limited means, having the highest level of a degree is the path. I think there is no credential that replaces the need for having a bachelor's degree, a master's degree. That's something that has to stay at the forefront, is that it's not something we often hear of those that say you don't need a college degree, but they always have one, or their kids have one. It's it is still the path. My grandfather was educated by two amazing HBCUs at a time when other institutions wouldn't allow him entry. I think it's important to remember in these times we're in, where truth is being questioned, where our history is being, erased, is that historically Black colleges and universities served some of the greatest leaders we've had to date, and they've served them at a time when no one else would. They're now wonderful places of community in times like these, when students need community, I think, more than ever. And so I think we're seeing HBCUs be that community for students that they need.
Amazing stuff there. We normally conclude with finishing thoughts. That was a nice piece you just gave us there, but any concluding thoughts? It's been wonderful having you on, but any takeaways for folks who stuck around with us?
If you made it this far, I think it's really just about, centering on the population you're ultimately serving. While we're supporting institutions, it's all to the means of supporting students. And I think in America right now, I think that's the greatest cause, is looking for the next generation that's going to lead us, ensuring that they get something better than we had. I think the fact that we even have to wonder, are the students in college going to get something better than I had? They should, and they should be able to be served better. And we just have to make sure that we're doing our best as the professionals in the space to make sure that we're setting students up to be better and have a better system than we had.
Amazing stuff here with Cecilia Marshall, the Chief Advancement Officer at Ed Advancement. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate it.
And for our listeners, if you like what you heard, please subscribe, tell your friends, write us reviews, do all the good things. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.